It was a warm Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that begged for grilled food, laughter, and time spent with family. The sky was clear. A soft breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers through the neighborhood, and the sound of children playing echoed from backyards. For Mark and his family, it was a perfect day to finally fire up the barbecue they had been saving for the start of summer. Their backyard wasn't extravagant, just a neat patch of grass, a sturdy wooden deck, and a stone barbecue pit that Mark had proudly built himself. Friends and relatives had been invited over, carrying trays of marinated meat, fresh vegetables, and coolers of cold drinks. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, and soon the sizzle of meat hitting the grill filled the air. Smoke curled lazily upward, fragrant with spices and hickory, spreading an irresistible aroma throughout the block. Most of the neighbors didn't mind. In fact, a few even waved from their porches, smiling as the smell carried to them. It was a kind of neighborhood where casual cookouts weren't unusual, though gatherings were often modest and kept within reason. Mark, however, had gone all out. His family had faced a rough year, and this barbecue wasn't just about food. It was about reclaiming a sense of normalcy, of joy, and of community. Yet, just beyond the cheerful laughter and clinking glasses, a storm was already brewing. Across the street, in a meticulously trimmed yard with hedges cut sharp as razors, lived Linda, better known to most as the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer of rules. She was a woman who thrived on order, control, and authority, whether real or imagined. Many whispered that she had once tried to get herself elected as the HOA president, but had lost after residents grew tired of her constant nitpicking. Still, that hadn't stopped her from finding ways to exert her influence. Linda, or as the neighborhood privately called her, Karen, had a reputation. She complained about lawn lengths, left notes about trash bins being out too early, and had once called animal control on a neighbor whose dog barked too loudly for her taste. She had a way of escalating minor inconveniences into personal crusades. And as fate would have it, Mark's barbecue smoke had caught her attention. From her window, Linda watched the gray wisps drift into the sky, her lips tightening with disapproval. She opened her patio door, stepped out, and wrinkled her nose dramatically, as if the smoke were poisonous fumes. Where others smelled seasoned ribs and charcoal, Linda claimed she smelled pollution and a public nuisance. Her irritation grew with each burst of laughter from Mark's backyard. In her mind, this wasn't just a barbecue. It was a direct assault on her peace and dignity. Neighbors on her side of the street tried to ignore her muttering, but it didn't take long for her to storm back inside, arms crossed, her mind spinning with plans. Linda wasn't the type to simply ask politely or endure. She thrived on confrontation. But today she chose another route. To her, this was a perfect moment to exercise her favorite weapon, calling the authorities. She picked up the phone and dialed, her tone sharp and urgent as she explained to the dispatcher that thick smoke was filling the neighborhood, causing her difficulty breathing and possibly violating safety codes. She didn't mention that she was the only one upset, nor that the smoke was just a normal byproduct of grilling. Instead, she painted a picture of chaos, exaggerating every detail in hopes of triggering an immediate response. As Mark turned ribs on the grill, completely unaware of the brewing trouble, Linda leaned against her window with a smug smile. In her mind, she had already won. The arrival of police would embarrass Mark, disrupt the party, and restore her sense of superiority. What she didn't know, however, was that this call would set off a chain of events far beyond her control. Events that would turn her plan upside down and expose her for the very troublemaker she had always been. The laughter continued. The smoke rose gently. And down the street, faintly at first, came the unmistakable sound of sirens drawing closer. The faint wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the cheerful hum of conversation and the crackle of the grill. At first, Mark's guests assumed it was just a patrol car passing through the neighborhood, as it often did on weekends. When the sound drew closer and then stopped right in front of the house, heads turned and voices quieted. 2 police cruisers rolled up to the curb, their lights flashing silently. The officers stepped out, calm but purposeful, their eyes scanning the scene as they approached the backyard. Guests shifted uncomfortably, children paused mid-play, and Mark himself froze, tongs still in hand, a rack of ribs halfway to being turned. The sight of police officers walking into what had been a joyful family gathering immediately sent a ripple of unease through the group. For Mark, confusion hit first, followed quickly by frustration. He had gone to great lengths to make sure everything was above board. Permits weren't required for a simple barbecue. There was no noise violation, and the grill was safely contained on his property. What could possibly have warranted a police presence? The answer stood across the street, peering out from behind her blinds with a self-satisfied smirk. Linda watched with glee as the officers entered the yard, convinced that justice, her version of it, was finally being served. She had already rehearsed how she would explain the health hazard to her neighbors, how she would frame it as protecting the community. In her mind, the humiliation of seeing the police arrive at Mark's cookout was punishment enough. The officers, however, weren't rushing in with accusations. Instead, they approached the grill, observed the setup, and then began asking calm, procedural questions. Was there a fire permit in place? Had there been complaints of excessive smoke? Was alcohol being served to minors? The questions were standard, meant to cover any potential liability, but to Mark and his guests, it was still deeply unsettling. Mark explained patiently, showing the officers the safety measures he'd taken. A fire extinguisher sat close by. The grill was well maintained, and the setup was a textbook example of responsible outdoor cooking. His food was sizzling, but nothing was burning uncontrollably. The officers nodded, clearly recognizing that nothing illegal was happening. Still, they had to follow through with the report, and that report, they revealed, had come from across the street. When Linda realized the officers were spending more time listening to Mark than shutting down the party, she stepped outside to insert herself into the situation. She strode across the lawn with a righteous air, gesturing dramatically to the rising smoke and fanning her face with exaggerated disgust. She insisted that the fumes were toxic, that her allergies were being aggravated, and that the barbecue was disturbing the peace. Her complaints spilled out one after another, escalating in intensity. She claimed the smoke was drifting into her home, that she couldn't breathe properly, and even that the fire posed a risk of spreading. It was a performance, polished and desperate, designed to turn the officers against Mark. The officers listened politely, but it was clear from their expressions that they weren't buying into the theatrics. The smoke was light, the food smelled normal, and the supposed toxic fumes were nothing more than the scent of barbecue. One officer even glanced at the sizzling ribs with a look that suggested he was more hungry than concerned. The neighbors, meanwhile, had started to gather quietly along the edges of the street. They watched the scene unfold with growing irritation, not at Mark, but at Linda. Many of them had tolerated her antics for years, biting their tongues to avoid conflict. But now, seeing her waste police time over a harmless cookout was too much. Whispered conversation spread, and sympathetic nods were exchanged. For the first time, Linda's usual weapon, calling an authority, was backfiring. Instead of intimidating her neighbors, it was drawing attention to her pettiness. The officers, professional but unimpressed, began shifting their focus away from Mark and toward the legitimacy of Linda's complaint. Mark's guests slowly relaxed as the tension faded, though frustration still lingered in the air. The children resumed playing. The laughter cautiously returned, but all eyes remained on the officers and Linda. The cookout had been disrupted, the atmosphere tainted, and the sense of joy replaced with unease. Yet beneath that unease, something else was beginning to grow, a collective sense that this time, Linda had crossed a line. The officers finished their assessment, but the situation was far from over, because when they turned back to Linda with pointed questions of their own, her carefully constructed performance began to crack, and with the whole neighborhood watching, she was about to face a humiliation she never saw coming. The air hung heavy with the smell of grilled food and tension as the officers shifted their stance. They had patiently listened to Linda's tirade, but now it was their turn to ask questions. Her dramatic claims of toxic smoke and health hazards didn't align with what they had just witnessed. The grill was controlled, the smoke minimal, and not a single guest appeared distressed. One officer asked Linda directly if she had any medical documentation supporting her claims about smoke sensitivity. She faltered, her mouth opening and closing as though scrambling for an answer. Finally, she muttered something vague about doctor's advice and sensitive lungs. But she could produce nothing concrete. The officer nodded, taking note, but his expression suggested skepticism. The second officer then asked if she had attempted to address the issue with her neighbor before calling the police. This question visibly rattled Linda. She hesitated, glancing around at the crowd of neighbors who had now gathered to watch. Her silence stretched too long, and when she finally blurted out that she shouldn't have to confront rule breakers, it sounded less like a defense and more like an excuse. The watching neighbors exchanged looks. This was typical Linda, skipping courtesy and leaping straight to enforcement. Normally, she thrived on the silence of others, knowing few people wanted to confront her directly. But here, under the gaze of officers and neighbors alike, her behavior no longer looked like authority. It looked like spite. One of the officers calmly reminded her that calling emergency services for non-emergencies could be considered a misuse of resources. The words hung in the air like a warning bell. Linda's face flushed red, her composure cracking as she tried to backtrack. She insisted that she had genuinely feared for her safety, pointing toward the grill as though it were a raging bonfire. But the image simply didn't match reality. Meanwhile, Mark stood silently by his grill, arms crossed, his guest behind him. He had answered every question clearly, provided proof of safety measures, and shown respect to the officers. In contrast, Linda's exaggerations were unraveling fast. The contrast between calm responsibility and frantic dramatics could not have been clearer. The neighbors began whispering, their voices carrying. Some shook their heads, others muttered about how she had done this before. Over lawns, over pets, over trivial matters that she spun into crises. For years, people had tolerated her antics quietly, but now her behavior was being exposed in real time. And this time, she couldn't silence the witnesses. The officers, sensing the growing crowd and wanting to de-escalate, told Linda they would document her complaint, but found no violation worth pursuing. They explained that barbecue smoke was not, in itself, a crime or a code violation unless it was excessive and unsafe, which clearly was not the case here. For Linda, it was a devastating blow. She had expected cheers of support, the shutdown of the party, and vindication. Instead, she was standing in the middle of the street with a dozen neighbors watching her get politely dismissed by the very authorities she had summoned. Her voice grew shrill as she protested. She accused the officers of taking sides, accused Mark of deliberately targeting her with a barbecue, and even accused the neighbors of conspiring against her. Each accusation landed flat, met with blank stares or suppressed laughter. What had started as her attempt to shame someone else was quickly spiraling into her own public embarrassment. The officers, now firm in tone, advised her to return to her home, and reminded her again of the seriousness of false or frivolous reports. Her eyes darted the crowd of neighbors, who were no longer sympathetic, but quietly pleased to see her facade crumble. She muttered something about injustice and unfair treatment, then stormed back across the street, slamming her front door with a bang that echoed down the block. The party guests exhaled, the tension lifting like smoke dissipating into the sky. The officers gave Mark a reassuring nod, even offering a faint smile before departing. Slowly, the chatter returned, laughter resumed, and the sound of sizzling meat filled the air again. But though the barbecue continued, the mood had shifted. Linda had been embarrassed, yes, but something deeper had happened that afternoon. The neighborhood, long silenced by her constant complaints, had seen the truth laid bare. She wasn't protector of order. She was a disruptor driven by control and spite. And now, instead of fearing her, they were beginning to see her as a problem that needed to be dealt with. For Linda, the humiliation stung, but she wasn't finished. Behind her closed curtains, she was already plotting her next move, determined to regain the upper hand. What she didn't realize was that her actions had crossed a threshold. The neighbors had seen too much, and patience was wearing dangerously thin. The stage was set for a conflict bigger than a single barbecue. The morning after the barbecue, the neighborhood felt different. Mark and his family went about their day as usual, but the echo of the previous night's drama lingered in conversations. Neighbors exchanged knowing looks. A few even stopped by to commend him for handling the situation so calmly. The sense of solidarity was subtle but growing. For once, Linda's antics had united people instead of dividing them. But across the street, Linda was seething. The humiliation of being dismissed by the officers had burned her pride, and the whispers she overheard from neighbors stung even more. She replayed the scene in her head over and over, each time twisting it to convince herself she was a victim. In her mind, she hadn't been unreasonable. She had been ignored, disrespected, and publicly mocked. That, to her, was intolerable. By midday, her retaliation began. It started small. Anonymous complaint slips shoved into Mark's mailbox, claiming his barbecue had violated neighborhood harmony. Then came the phone calls, long-winded rants to the HOA office about supposed violations of smoke regulations and property use. When those didn't gain traction, she escalated further, emailing the entire HOA board demanding immediate disciplinary action against Mark for what she described as reckless endangerment. The HOA, already familiar with Linda's history of grievances, treated her complaints with caution. They logged them, but they did not act swiftly. Too many of her past claims had fallen apart under scrutiny. Still, the flood of accusations created tension. Letters were sent to Mark requesting explanations, not fines but warnings, and though he knew they were baseless, the hassle was frustrating. Linda wasn't finished. Within days, she began her next tactic: petty sabotage. Mark found his garbage bins mysteriously knocked over in the night, their contents scattered across the curb. His sprinklers, once functioning perfectly, suddenly malfunctioned, with evidence of tampering clear upon inspection. Even his guests who parked near a property during visits reported anonymous notes on their windshields, warning them to respect the neighborhood. It was harassment, but cleverly veiled. No direct proof tied her to the acts, though everyone suspected it was her. The pattern was too familiar, the timing too precise. Linda was careful to operate in the shadows, hiding behind anonymous notes and vague complaints. But the intent was crystal clear. She wanted to make life miserable for Mark and his family. Yet, if Linda thought she was regaining control, she was mistaken. Instead of isolating Mark, her actions drew more support for him. Neighbors began speaking out, recounting their own experiences of Linda's meddling. Stories surfaced of her trying to dictate lawn decorations, calling animal control over harmless pets, and berating delivery drivers for parking too close to her driveway. Each story painted a clearer picture. Linda wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was terrorizing it. By the end of the week, small groups of residents were openly discussing her behavior. Conversations that had once been whispered were now spoken confidently. Some neighbors even approached Mark, offering to testify if the situation escalated further. For the first time, Linda's intimidation tactics were weakening, her power slipping through her fingers. Still, she doubled down. Late at night, she sent emails accusing Mark of organizing rowdy gatherings and spreading toxic smoke intentionally. She framed herself as a victim of targeted harassment, insisting that the neighborhood was ganging up on her. But instead of sympathy, her pleas were met with skepticism. The HOA board, tired of her constant stream of baseless complaints, began to view her as the problem rather than the solution. Meanwhile, Mark stayed patient. He documented every incident: the overturned bins, the tampered sprinklers, the notes. He gathered witness statements from neighbors and saved copies of every letter and email. He knew better than to respond in anger. Instead, he prepared quietly, building a case that would speak louder than any confrontation. Linda mistook his silence for weakness. In her mind, she was winning, regaining the upper hand through persistence. What she didn't realize was that her actions were weaving a rope around her own reputation, one that would soon tighten beyond escape. As another weekend approached, whispers spread that Mark was planning another cookout, this time smaller, quieter, but very intentional. Neighbors eagerly accepted invitations, not just for food, but to stand in solidarity. It wasn't just about grilled ribs anymore. It was about reclaiming peace from the chaos Linda had sown. And across the street, watching from behind her blinds, Linda seethed once more. She saw the gathering plans, the neighbors uniting, and felt her control slipping further away. To her, it wasn't just a barbecue. It was rebellion. Her retaliation was about to reach its peak, and with it, The stage was set for her most disastrous mistake yet. The second cookout began on a quiet Saturday evening. This time, it wasn't just about food or fun. It was about unity. Word had spread quickly, and nearly every neighbor Mark invited showed up, bringing side dishes, desserts, and lawn chairs. The atmosphere wasn't rowdy or excessive, just warm and communal, as if everyone was collectively standing their ground. The grill sizzled, laughter carried, and children darted around with sparklers as the sun dipped below the rooftops. For once, the neighborhood felt alive with camaraderie. But across the street, Linda watched, her blinds pulled back just enough for her scowl to peek through. Each burst of laughter stung her pride. Every friendly wave exchanged between neighbors deepened her sense of isolation. She had already filed multiple complaints during the week, all ignored or dismissed. The HOA board had grown weary of her accusations. The police had politely cautioned her, and the neighbors openly avoided her. Now, watching the community gather without her, her frustration boiled into rage. She decided that if no one else would act, she would take matters into her own hands. As the evening settled in, the smell of grilled food once again wafted across the street. This time, Linda didn't just call the HOA or send emails. She stormed into her backyard, dragging out an old camcorder and a notepad, determined to document every detail. She recorded children laughing, adults chatting, and smoke rising lightly from the grill. She scribbled down times, convinced she was building a case for harassment and noise violations. But filming wasn't enough for her. As the night wore on and her anger consumed her, Linda crossed the line. She crept toward the edge of her property and hurled a small bag of water balloons into Mark's yard, aiming for the grill. The balloons missed, splattering harmlessly on the grass, but her motion was seen. A group of neighbors gasped as they turned to catch a retreating shadow, scurrying back across the street. That was the moment everything shifted. Phones came out, cameras rolled, and Linda's actions were captured clearly. No more speculation, no more anonymous sabotage. Here was undeniable evidence of her harassment. Word spread to the gathering quickly. Neighbors murmured with outrage, and Mark, still calm, instructed everyone to stay composed. He didn't retaliate, didn't yell, didn't stoop to her level. Instead, he quietly noted the time, encouraged those who filmed to save their videos, and went on with the evening. The decision not to escalate in the moment spoke louder than any argument could have. Linda, unaware of how much she had just exposed herself, wasn't finished. Around an hour later, she called the police once more, claiming that the gathering had grown out of control and that people were trespassing on her property. When officers arrived again, they were met not with suspicion, but with a dozen neighbors ready to provide testimony and video evidence. One by one, they showed their phones. Footage of Linda throwing water balloons, recordings of her shouting obscenities across the street, clips of her filming children without permission. The officers, faced with overwhelming evidence, turned their focus squarely on her. This time, there was no polite dismissal. The officers crossed the street and confronted Linda directly. Though the neighbors couldn't hear every word, they saw her expression shift from confidence to denial to outright panic. Her arms flailed as she tried to defend herself, but the officers remained firm. They warned her of harassment charges, of the consequences of continued false reports, and made it clear that her behavior was now officially documented. The neighbors stood together silently, watching as the woman who had tormented them for so long was finally being held accountable. For years, Linda had wielded fear and intimidation like weapons, but now the balance had shifted. She wasn't in control anymore. When the officers left, the street was quiet for a long moment. Then, one by one, neighbors began clapping. It wasn't loud or mocking, just steady, unified, and symbolic. Mark didn't cheer, but he allowed himself a small smile. The truth had finally been dragged into the light. Inside her home, Linda slammed her blinds shut and retreated into darkness. Her calls for authority had backfired spectacularly. Instead of humiliating Mark, she had humiliated herself. Publicly, undeniably, and irreversibly. But the story wasn't over yet, because the HOA board, armed with the evidence neighbors had collected, was about to make its move. And Linda was about to face consequences far more lasting than a single night's embarrassment. The following week, the neighborhood was buzzing. The incident with the water balloons, the recordings, and Linda's confrontation with police had spread quickly. For years, people had whispered about her antics behind closed doors, but now they had proof. For the first time, neighbors felt empowered to act together, and they knew exactly where to take their evidence: the HOA board. At the next HOA meeting, the turnout was larger than usual. Normally sparsely attended, the gathering was now filled with residents, many clutching printouts of emails, letters, and screenshots. Mark attended quietly, bringing his folder of documented harassment. But he wasn't alone. One by one, his neighbors approached him beforehand, offering their support. This wasn't just his battle anymore. It was the neighborhood's. When the meeting began, the board called for concerns, and the floodgates opened. Residents spoke openly about Linda's years of petty complaints, her habit of calling authorities over minor inconveniences, and now, her harassment of Mark. Videos were played showing her throwing objects, yelling across the street, and filming children without permission. The evidence was undeniable. The board members, usually diplomatic and hesitant, shifted uncomfortably as the scale of Linda's behavior became clear. They had long treated her as a nuisance, but not a true threat. Yet now, faced with documented harassment and police involvement, they could no longer remain passive. Discussions quickly turned from sympathy to action. After hours of testimony, the board voted unanimously to impose severe penalties. Linda was fined heavily for violating HOA community standards, cited for harassment, and officially warned that further misconduct could result in legal action or even removal proceedings. It was the strongest disciplinary action the HOA had ever issued against a resident. But perhaps more devastating than the fines was the isolation. The neighborhood, once cowed into silence, now stood united against her. Parents forbade their children from approaching her property. Neighbors who had once tolerated her conversations now crossed the street to avoid her. The few who had occasionally defended her could no longer deny what they had seen with their own eyes. Linda was cut off, her influence shattered. For Mark, the resolution was bittersweet. He hadn't wanted a war with his neighbor. He had only wanted a simple barbecue with his family. But in standing his ground calmly and refusing to stoop to her level, he had not only defended himself but helped free the neighborhood from years of quiet misery. His cookout had become a turning point, a catalyst for change. The following weekend, the neighborhood gathered again, this time not just for food but to celebrate. The cookout was smaller, quieter, yet filled with laughter that carried more freely than before. For once, everyone felt relaxed, free from the fear of a sudden interruption. Children played without worry. Adults chatted openly, and Mark stood by his grill, the smell of sizzling food drifting peacefully through the air. Across the street, Linda's curtains remained drawn. Occasionally, a shadow moved behind them, but no one paid her any mind. She had become a ghost of her former self, present but powerless, silenced by her own actions. As the night grew darker, neighbors toasted not just to good food and company, but to the end of an era, the reign of a self-appointed enforcer, finally brought down by truth and unity. For Mark, it was vindication. For the neighborhood, it was liberation. And for Linda, it was the bitter taste of consequences she had brought entirely upon herself. The story that had begun with smoke ended with clarity. And in the end, the only thing left lingering in the air was the smell of victory and barbecue.